A graduate tax is a way of paying for higher education that differs from tuition fees. Instead of taking out loans and paying interest on them, graduates pay a percentage of their income above a certain threshold for a fixed period of time. This means that the cost of university education is linked to the earnings of graduates, rather than the upfront fees charged by universities. Some of the advantages of a graduate tax are: it is progressive, meaning that those who benefit more from higher education pay more. This could reduce inequality and make higher education more accessible to students from poorer backgrounds. It is simple, meaning that graduates do not have to worry about repaying loans, interest rates, or debt. This could reduce stress and encourage more people to pursue higher education. It is fair, meaning that graduates pay according to their ability to pay, rather than a fixed amount. This could avoid situations where some graduates pay more than the cost of their education, while others pay less or nothing at all. Some of the disadvantages of a graduate tax are: it could reduce university funding, as the government would have to collect and distribute the tax revenue to universities, rather than letting them charge fees directly. This could affect the quality and diversity of higher education provision. It could reduce student choice, as graduates would not be able to choose which university or course they want to study based on the fees they are willing to pay. This could limit the competition and innovation among universities. It could create a brain drain, as graduates might be tempted to work abroad or avoid declaring their income to avoid paying the tax. This could deprive the country of skilled workers and tax revenue. In summary, a graduate tax is an alternative way of financing higher education that has some potential benefits and drawbacks compared to tuition fees. It is based on the idea that graduates should contribute to the cost of their education according to their income, rather than taking out loans and paying interest on them. Why does Labour want to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax? Give some background on the current system of tuition fees in England, which was introduced by the Labour government in 1998 and increased by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in 2012. Highlight some of the criticisms of tuition fees, such as their high level, their burden on students and graduates, their effect on social mobility and access, and their contribution to the rising student debt. Here is a possible script for this section. Labour wants to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax because it believes that the current system of tuition fees is unfair, unsustainable, and discourages students from poorer backgrounds from going to university. A graduate tax would mean that graduates would pay a percentage of their income for a certain period of time after they start earning, instead of taking out loans to pay upfront fees. Labour argues that this would make higher education more accessible, more progressive, and more stable. The current system of tuition fees in England was introduced by the Labour government in 1998, when students were required to pay up to £1,000 a year for tuition. This was based on the idea that students should contribute to the cost of their education, but also that tuition should be free for those from lower-income families. In 2004, Labour raised the fees to £3,000 a year and introduced variable fees, allowing universities to charge different amounts for different courses. In 2012, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government increased the fees to £9,000 a year and removed the cap on the number of students that universities could admit. The government also changed the terms of student loans, raising the interest rate, the repayment threshold, and the repayment period. The current system of tuition fees has been widely criticized for several reasons. First, critics say that the fees are too high and put off many potential students from applying to university, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. According to the Office for Students, there is still a significant gap in participation rates between students from different socioeconomic groups. Second, critics say that the fees impose a heavy burden on students and graduates, who have to repay their loans with interest over a long period of time. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the average debt for graduates in England is £50,800 and about three-quarters of them will not pay off their loans in full. Third, critics say that the fees have a negative effect on social mobility and access, as they create a two-tier system of higher education where some students can afford to go to more prestigious universities or courses while others are excluded or limited by their financial circumstances. According to the Sutton Trust, there is still a large gap in access rates between students from different ethnic groups and regions. Fourth, critics say that the fees contribute to the rising student debt, which has implications for both individuals and society. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, student debt is expected to reach £1.5 trillion by 2049 and account for 6.5% of GDP. In summary, Labour wants to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax because it thinks that the current system is unfair, unsustainable, and discourages students from poorer backgrounds from going to university. A graduate tax would mean that graduates would pay a percentage of their income for a certain period of time after they start earning, instead of taking out loans to pay upfront fees. Labour argues that this would make higher education more accessible, more progressive, and more stable. What are the pros and cons of Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax? Analyze some of the potential benefits and drawbacks of Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax. Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax is a controversial idea that has been debated for many years. A graduate tax is a system where students do not pay upfront fees for their university education, but instead pay a percentage of their income after graduation for a certain period of time. The amount they pay would depend on how much they earn and how long they work. A graduate tax is different from the current system of student loans and tuition fees, where students borrow money from the government to pay for their fees and then repay it with interest once they earn above a certain threshold. There are several arguments in favor of Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax. Some of the potential benefits are: a graduate tax would reduce the language of debt and the price tag attached to a degree. Many students are deterred from applying to university because of the fear of accumulating large debts and having to repay them for decades. A graduate tax would shift the perception of higher education from a financial transaction to a social investment, and make it more accessible and affordable for students from all backgrounds. A graduate tax would make payments more proportional to income and ability to pay. Under the current system, graduates have to repay their loans regardless of their earnings, which can create financial hardship and inequality. A graduate tax would link payments to income, so that graduates who earn more would pay more, and those who earn less would pay less or nothing at all. This would make the system more progressive and fair, and ensure that graduates contribute according to their benefits from higher education. A graduate tax would end the possibility of differential fees based on university or course quality. Under the current system, universities can charge up to £9,250 per year for undergraduate courses, regardless of their quality or reputation. This creates a market where some universities and courses are seen as more valuable than others, and where students may choose based on price rather than interest or suitability. A graduate tax would eliminate this distinction and ensure that all universities and courses are funded equally by the government, based on student numbers and costs. A graduate tax would allow for more public investment in higher education. Under the current system, universities rely heavily on tuition fees as their main source of income, which makes them vulnerable to fluctuations in demand and competition. A graduate tax would provide a more stable and predictable source of funding for universities, as it would be collected by the government and distributed according to need. This would enable universities to plan ahead and invest in teaching, research, and facilities, and improve the quality and diversity of higher education. However, there are also several arguments against Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax. Some of the potential drawbacks are: a graduate tax would affect the autonomy and diversity of universities. Under the current system, universities have some degree of freedom and flexibility in setting their own fees, curricula, and admissions policies, which allows them to respond to changing needs and demands of students and employers. A graduate tax would reduce this autonomy, as universities would be dependent on government funding and regulation, which could limit their innovation and diversity. A graduate tax would create uncertainty and instability in university funding. Under the current system, universities receive tuition fees upfront from students or the government, which gives them a clear and immediate income stream. A graduate tax would defer payments until after graduation, which means that universities would have to wait for years or decades before receiving any revenue from their students. This would create cash flow problems and financial risks for universities, especially in times of economic downturn or demographic change. A graduate tax would influence student behavior and incentives. Under the current system, students have an incentive to complete their studies as quickly as possible and find well-paid jobs after graduation, as this would reduce their loan repayments and interest charges. A graduate tax would remove this incentive, as students would have to pay the same percentage of their income regardless of how long they study or how much they earn. This could encourage students to prolong their studies or pursue lower-paid careers, which could reduce their productivity and contribution to society. A graduate tax would compare unfavorably with other models of higher education funding, such as those in Scotland, Wales, or other countries. Under the current system, students in England pay higher tuition fees than those in Scotland or Wales, where fees are either abolished or subsidized by the devolved governments. A graduate tax would not address this disparity, as it would still require English graduates to pay more for their education than their counterparts in other parts of the UK or abroad. This could create resentment and unfairness among students and graduates. In conclusion, Labour's proposal to replace tuition fees with a graduate tax has both advantages and disadvantages. It could make higher education more accessible, affordable, fair, and public-oriented, but it could also undermine university autonomy, funding stability, student motivation, and international competitiveness. The feasibility and desirability of such a proposal depends on how it is designed and implemented in practice.